it's already rather strange in terms of some of the bits that get mapped. So that's one way. It's a very strange way of answering the question, where is language? But it's one possible thing that gets done. The other way we might approach this, and as Joseph says here, is the classic modernist answer to that question. And Joseph actually does have a section in his book on language, mind and body called Where is Language? He says the answer is often then in the mind, and the answer to where is mind is in the brain. And so language from that point of view is located, as we see here, in parts of the brain. And of course, as we know too, you can't map languages individually. And also, as neurolinguistics has shown us, it's actually much more complicated than these particular areas of the brain. But this is one way people can start to approach this question. One of the things that happens in linguistics is we get a series of exclusions in introductory textbooks. It's true of all disciplines in a way. They say what's in and what's out of a discipline. And introductory books to linguistics establish what counts as language with a particular focus on things like signs and rules, and then the kind of things that are excluded explicitly, or explicitly excluded, such as animal communication, and also implicitly, often less explicitly excluded, sort of bodies and things and so on. So we tend to get this sort of thing, which is that's part of linguistics, heads swinging language back and forth from Saussure's original diagram. And language maybe looks something like this, of trees and how we string sentences together. What that means is that there's a range of things that are excluded. And part of my argument that I've started to make is that in the process of doing that, as we've, or as linguists have said, you know, this is what counts as language and this is what doesn't, they've had to come up with a very arcane version of language that is just about heads and about trees and about sentences, and a very, very limited version of what is language. And so things like this things like bodies, sexuality and so on are out. And things like this are just not part of what we count as anything to do with language. Though we could argue a different case. So the question, where is language, is actually the title of a book by the anthropologist Ruth Finnegan. And she argues that we've missed a great deal in anthropological and other studies by not focusing on other areas that talk about language. And as she says, as we start to refocus what we're interested in, we can start to move away from a cognitive, language-centered model of the nature and destiny of humanity towards a focus on the gestural, pictorial, sculptural, sonic, tactile, bodily, affective, and artifactual dimensions of human life. We're seeing part of this shift in focus happening in linguistics, social linguistics, what we might call a trans-linguistic shift. And I think Mike Bainham is going to be talking about that later today or tomorrow, I forget. And I won't be able to hear that, which is a shame. But so the trans-linguistic shift towards languages as non-discrete, which usually means both that the borders between languages are fuzzy, and also that the boundaries between language and what often has counted as non-language is also much more open. So we get this broadening of what we might call the semiotic spectrum to include bodies, things, senses, and places. That means that we get an understanding of language as an integrated aspect of embodied and embedded semiotic resources, and I'll be returning to those ideas later. Also part of this is the appreciation of other, what we might call indigenous southern ways of thinking about language, and a view of cognition, agency, and language as distributed beyond human actors, and that's going to be a major focus of what I want to talk about today. Part of this is then a goal to unsettle humanist assumptions. When we're trying to grasp what humanist assumptions are, I found a good list in a book by Theodor Schatzky, on practice theory. And he says, he lists these 5 assumptions. He says that the epistemological, which privileges the human mind as the exclusive place of knowledge; the psychological, which assumes that humans are masters of their own psyches; the moral, which puts political ethical values only within human thought; the agential, so that human agency is seen as distinct and voluntary; and the definitional, basically human life differs absolutely from all other forms of life. And these are assumptions, I think, they're being challenged, and they're worth challenging for a number of reasons. This is also part of this bigger set of questions I've been trying to ask, linking post-humanist and thought and Southern theory, which is about questioning the absences in current ways of thinking, asking why it is we think in particular ways and how we might think differently. And how, in Povinelli's terms, can we think in geontological terms and beyond what she calls the carbon imaginary. This then links to the work of your colleague in Coimbra, De Sousa Santos, and his work on what he calls cognitive justice, and the point that the understanding of the world by far exceeds the Western understanding of the world. And it's these 2 projects coming together in part that interest me in particular. This also links to then of questions of new materialism, in particular the work of someone like Karen Barad, who it's always worth returning to, I think. And one of Barad's concerns, and she's looking particularly at the way that ideas such as discourse have become very powerful across the social sciences. And as she said fairly famously now, the only thing that doesn't seem to matter anymore is matter. And her work tries to, as the title of a book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, says we've got to rethink our relationship to matter, to things, to objects. So we're shifting the focus then from questions of a correspondence, which comes out of a long Western history of philosophy. So this correspondence between descriptions and reality to matters of practices, doings, and actions. This is also about challenging what we call the humanness of meaning making. I took that term from this book by Burnett and Merchant. And it struck me as interesting the way that we've made animals often the objects of our signs. I've actually been trying to think why it is that we, when we talk about signs in the Saussurean linguistic sense, we often talk about dogs and cats, sometimes trees, not much else somehow, but and there's something very simple maybe about those words, dogs and cats, but we kind of objectify animals in this way and say, okay, the dog image there is the signified and the word dog is the signifier, and together they make the sign. Of course, that's been challenged a great deal by this interest in animal semiosis and also cross-species communication, and people looking very seriously at how animals such as birds and whales and monkeys and many others communicate between each other, and how that's also perceived by other species and so on. So this raises a lot of questions about the centrality of meaning making as a human activity. Important in this thinking too is the idea of assemblages. And I'd like to, if people haven't read the book by Anna Tsing, particularly interesting work on what she calls the mushroom at the end of the world. She studies in this book the matsutake, the Japanese mushroom, which is a very expensive, strong-smelling mushroom. And what she's interested in is how these things come together in assemblages. The idea of assemblage goes back particularly to Deleuze and Guattari, but it's now got a complex history in a way. One of the things that interests Tsing in her book is that when you get quite large global shifts, she actually goes back to the effects of Chernobyl, which may affect us again if things go wrong in Ukraine. The effect of the original Chernobyl explosion affected the price of mushrooms around the world, and it meant that mushrooms on the east coast, on the west coast of the United States, particularly in Oregon, they became a very useful commodity, and so a lot of people went foraging for mushrooms. But as she points out, the people who want to go foraging, see that as an worthwhile economic activity, are First Nations people, Indo-Chinese migrants, disabled war veterans, and so on. And her interest then is how, because these mushrooms grow in particular cleared pine forests, so there's human activity that often helps them grow, even though they're kind of a natural, they grow naturally. So she's interested in these assemblages of people, places, things, and how these become, as she says, happenings that are greater than the sum of the parts. And I think there's this other important point that the idea of new materialism is sometimes seen as opposing an old materialism, which is potentially very neo-Marxist dominated in ways of assuming what material means in socioeconomic terms. Tsing's point is that we can look at both, right? We can expand what we mean by the material world and our relation to it without ignoring political economy. It becomes part of an assemblage, but not the defining part. We can also look at assemblages in educational contexts, and Kelly Tui's work in Canada is particularly interesting on this. As she says, when we look at what she calls social material assemblages, we can see how human bodies, the setup of the classroom, the materials, as well as things like discourses about teaching, knowledge, school policies, the curriculum, and so on. All these things are entangled, and we'll come back to entanglements later as well. All these things are entangled together in these classroom assemblages. And finally, in this introductory stage, I want to go back to this question I raised briefly earlier about other ways of knowing. Paul Cross-Gritty has been writing recently about what he calls language ideological assemblages, where we can look at the relations between language and ideology and family and culture and land and artifacts and so on, again, in these assemblages coming together. And one of the things that's been interesting me when we look at endangered, which is a very problematic term, languages, is this idea that they've been sleeping. And this is Wesley Leonard talking about Miamia, which is a language in the central United States. And he says it's been sleeping for a long time. Now, for some from a Western tradition, might say, okay, this is a metaphor, languages don't sleep. But I think we have to take this much more seriously. And as Monaghan says in the Australian context, we have to understand language and stories as being in the land, having been placed there by ancestors, and that the idea of language reclamation or revitalization in various ways that's talked about, when people are talking about their sleeping languages, this is a spiritual process as much as the kind of documentation that linguists often get involved in. In a different context, in Northern Australia and Arnhem Land, speakers of Moringa, which is right up on the north coast, talk about their saltwater words, their language of saltwater words. And again, we need to take this seriously. And I think in relationship to the work of Ingersoll, actually in Hawaii, about what she calls seascape epistemologies, how we understand relations between language or she's not so interested in language, about the sea and our relationship to it. And I think also here we see language and the sea in a very different way of thinking about that relationship. So let me now turn to the idea of distribution and distributed cognition. And I want to talk through various forms of thinking about distribution. This is drawing particularly on the work of Hutchins and his book, Cognition in the Wild, which is now quite old, from 1995. And his argument is that cognition involves much more than the brain. It includes a lot of artifacts, other people, cultural systems, and so on. And he looks at navigation as an example of this. And the beginning of his book, his 1995 book, starts actually on the bridge of a ship. And he talks through in quite complex ways how we can understand. And we ask the question, how do we understand where navigation is happening here in the brains, the bodies of the people who are also interacting in the various machinery they have, the digital displays, the different controls, and the ship as a whole. He said this is all interacting, and it would be foolish to somehow put navigation into the head of one of these people. And from there we get the point that he makes, that cognition needs to be studied ethnographically, which I think is a really crucial point and shows how we've, I think for so long, got cognition wrong as something we can study in isolation. So in this book, Cognition in the Wild, Hutchins talks about what he says the heavy interaction of internal and external structures. He's suggesting the boundary between inside and outside, between individual and context should be softened. And for me, I also navigate as a sailor. I have a boat down in the harbor here. This is not a picture of my boat. This is a slightly nicer looking boat. But I do have some of these that aren't working so well, navigational tools. And we use these. They interact with the wind, the speed of the boat through the water, and so on. And we, as sailors, will be holding a wheel, steering, feeling the boat, feeling the wind, looking at these instruments, and we know how the boat is oriented in particular ways to the water, and so on. So there's a very complex set of relations between us as navigators, as sailors, and our surrounds and the boat, and so on. And another point from Hutchins in another paper is really that, just to make the point that navigation, or sorry, distributed cognition is not new. It's been going on a very long time, and navigation has. And it's also not special. He says all cognition can be seen as emerging from distributed processes. He also has a strong interest in Polynesian navigation. And this is going back to his point about different cultural systems. The Polynesians populated large parts of the Pacific, going from island to island, and they went back and forth as well, right? Covering huge distances, and had very complex, and still have very complex ways of navigating, but they're very different from Western concepts of that. In part, you use some of the same things. The celestial navigation uses the stars, but in a different way in terms of your understanding of what is moving and where you are in relationship to them. And so one of his interests is also trying to understand how Polynesian navigation as a different way of navigating operates. And we've now seen various recreations of Polynesian voyages with sort of newly modeled ships, but using the old techniques. And as Thompson says in her study of these, and she's not coming from a cognitive position, she's writing about voyaging, but we can see how navigation from this point of view is experienced as an embodied practice. And it's coupled to this deep inherited cultural understandings of island and ocean shared by the people over a very long time. And we then have to account how that gets passed on. And such navigational expertise is then not just an alternative knowledge, but we might say knowing in a different way. I'm also interested as a scuba diver in, thinking a lot about navigation from this point of view as an underwater diver. Navigation is very important underwater. As you can see, it's often not that clear. And it's very important that you get usually back to where you started, or sometimes to somewhere else. It matters for your safety in fundamental ways. Now, Stephenson talks again about, and I won't go into the distinction between extended mind and distributed cognition. There's quite a discussion of that. But as he says, they share the central tenet that human cognition is non-local. It draws on brains, bodies, surroundings, including other cognizers, artifacts, social relations, environmental structures. So I try to map some of this from diving. This is diving in the Philippines. And we often start on land or on a boat with someone draws up a chart. And of course, that chart has a history. This is drawn on a whiteboard, but this is from their knowledge of the local diving conditions. They'll draw this up and explain when we're diving, what side of the island we're diving, what the currents are going to be like, and so on. Then we have to transfer that into the water. What I call relocalizing a diagram or description, because sometimes it is just oral. They just say, okay, we're going to go here, do this. We've got to transfer that into a physical environment. Now, we have various instruments. We often do carry a compass on the wrist or in some other part of our equipment, but also things like we monitor the time, we monitor the air pressure and the depth. This is three-dimensional navigation. and the depth is a very important issue for us too. We do a lot of observation. You remember topographical features, rocks, outcrops, sand patches, and so on. And we use our knowledge of the reef structure. So if you are diving on that northeast corner and going north, you'll know that you've got a particular kind of formation likely to be happening on your left side, and that you're therefore going north, and so on. And we orient in a very bodily way. We feel the current, we sense the water temperature, what we call thermoclines, and we gauge the speed through the water. We often try and measure that with kicks relative to the current. And we do stay in touch with each other. We always dive together. You always dive with at least one other person, and we communicate. Some people have expensive, complex things. Most of us do it with hand gestures, and they're set hand gestures. So, for example, this doesn't mean okay. This means okay. This means I'm going up, and you don't want to confuse the two. You don't want to do this and then meaning I'm going to the surface. So we have a lot of ways of communicating with various established signals underwater. So that's trying to map out, and through some of my own personal thinking about this, the idea of distributed cognition. When we move to distributed agency, a lot of work has pointed out that we see agency very problematically as very much located in the individual person. We assume that we also see it as something someone has, people have agency, I want to give you agency, use your agency, and so on. But as Nick Enfield says, it's really radically distributed. One person may work toward another's goals, two people goals may be shared, one person may be held accountable for another person's behavior, and so on. So he sees this as very much interactionally achieved. But I don't think that goes far enough, because I'm interested in what Jane Bennett has to say about this, which is that agency may be distributed across an ontologically heterogeneous field. So that rather than being a capacity to localize in the human body or in a collective, it's distributed around a different range. So it's asking what effects do things have on other things, which is really a way of understanding agency. If we move on to the idea of distributed identity, again, we see the same problems of a long-term focus on identity as being located in the individual, this autonomous individual who has agency, choice over action, thought, and being. And identity is seen very much located in things like individual difference. Post-structuralism unsettled this to some extent by seeing identity as discursively produced. So it's a site of struggle, changes over time, and so on. But I don't think that really takes us beyond the individual in useful ways, at least. David Block, in a very recent book on identity and research, talks about our material being in the world. And I think this is a really useful way to think about this. He actually focuses then much more on what we might call social and cultural differences and how they intersect. So he's interested in gender, race, ethnicity, and the intersection of these. But I think there's a more important question to ask about our material being in the world. Brigitte Busch takes us some of the way here by trying to link interactional, post-structuralist, and phenomenological approaches in what she calls Spracherleben, the lived experience of language. And she uses these images up in the corner here to show how she gets kids and so on to draw languages on these bodies as a way of getting them to think about language and the body and where that fits. But we can go a bit further than this. Sorry, my lights just... you probably are wondering what on earth this picture is supposed to be. A couple of weeks ago, a very famous Australian cricketer died, a guy called Shane Warne. And he was very well known, and he already has a statue. These are the feet of his statue in Melbourne. And his funeral, they had a huge funeral with hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people a few days ago. What interested me here was this picture at the feet of his statue. People had left beer bottles. not flowers or candles or cards and things, but mainly beer bottles. There's a cricket ball, there's a few other objects around. And it's also important that the beer bottle is a VB, which is Victoria Bitter, which is sort of the local beer from there. Because he was seen as a beer drinking, also cigarette smoking, which is maybe why he died in his 50s, cricket player. And it interests me that this is part of his, in a sense, his distributed identity, his material being in the world, this statue with the beer at his feet. So let me just give you a little bit of data to expand this idea of distributed identity. This is from the work, from some of the work I've been doing with Emi Otsuji. This is from a Bangladeshi-run store in Isorama Yokucho, Islamic Alley in Shinjuku in Tokyo. And we've been recording and looking at data from that shop for a number of years. So this is a moment where there are three young men. They're walking around the store. And one of them stops and points to the counter. Now, on the counter, there are a range of banknotes under a piece of plastic, and then there's a donation can for the local mosque and various other things. But he starts focusing on one of these banknotes. And there's this interaction. Just before that, the three of them are talking, and he says, Anglo-Americanos, that's in Uzbek. Who are these darker people? Seem like Indians. They're not too sure what kind of shop they're in, and this sort of slightly racialized question about who are these people also locates them in particular ways. But as they move to the counter, one of the shopkeepers sees them and thinks, oh, okay, I better go and help. And he says, oh, hello, brother. What do you want? Please tell me. Now, the choice of English here is it's one of the languages used in the shop. Not the most common, most often they use Bangla, but also Hindi, Urdu, Nepali, and so on. But they use English and Japanese a fair bit too. And so he's not quite sure who these guys are. And so he just says, okay, I'll try English. So what do you want? Can I help you? And then the young Uzbek man says, watashi tachi no. This is ours, pointing to the 1,000 banknote. Now, we could look at this as really just, okay, this is indexical sign. Here's the finger, point at the banknote. This means I'm from Uzbekistan. But I think what becomes more interesting here when we think about these young men in the shop trying to work out where they are, and we see this as a much bigger assemblage of objects and meanings. Here in this Bangladeshi shop in Tokyo, we are Uzbek and they are non-Uzbek, and they are darker people. We're not quite sure who they are. And this is partly realized through these material artifacts. So this shows us, I think, how identity is not something individual, it's sort of out there in part in the world. And so distributed identity in this way includes people, language, places, things, and so on. Moving then to distributed language. As Stephenson says, language is neither a system nor located in the human head. Instead of resources, always part of a great embodied, situated, distributed affective whole. And Stephen Cowdery, who's edited a book on distributed language, talks about this idea as language arises as we give voice to wordings, make gestures, deal with objects, and so on. Again, it's sort of not about language as system, mind, and the body, but about the interdependency of voices, gestures, and artifacts. So from this point, we can start to think about embodied, embedded, and distributed language. So as Stephenson says, again, language and cognition are on the one hand embodied, they're also embedded, and they're enacted. They're also extended, distributed, and situated in a parallel way to the way we can look at cognition. Again, this image here is from some of our data. We got very interested in people using shopping lists and trying to work out what role shopping lists play. I mean, they have a history. People put them together, they write them out based on recipes they want to make, things they missing from their cupboards, things they want to stock up on, and so on. This is a woman of Moroccan background. She's got a long list of things partly in Moroccan Arabic, sometimes in French, and so on. And She's going through this list with a thumb, ticking things off, picking them off, picking items off the shelves, putting them in a basket, talking to her husband, and so on. And it interests us how this language here is part of this world. It's outside here. It's doing this interrelated work with the artifacts on the shelf, the things that are bought, and as that happens, the meanings of things on that list and the meanings of the items that she's bought changes, and she's buying things like chickpeas and lentils to turn into Moroccan food from this Bangladeshi store, and so on. So our point here is this isn't just about including non-verbal communication or saying that context is important. It's shifting the locus of where things happen. So suggesting that language use is not an internally motivated process of choice between language items, as is often seen, but a more distributed process that involves places, things, senses, and bodies. Annelies Custers has talked about the idea of what she calls semiotic repertoires, translingual practices, being multimodal, signs, mouthings, gestures, images, smells, and things. And Annelies works particularly with sign languages and the deaf community. But she's also trying to expand that into new ways of thinking about that. Emi Otsuji and I have from there talked about what we call spatial repertoires, which is again just to argue that the idea of a linguistic repertoire doesn't just sit inside people. It's distributed in that environment, and it's more useful to think about a repertoire being in a place than in a person. So I just wanted to move on to one other topic briefly, because a number of people obviously at this conference have a particular interest in English, and I've been talking very broadly about questions of language and so on here. This is related to a slightly different project of mine, where I wrote about entanglements of English. What I was trying to do was think about ways in which English is, or any language, but I have also a particular interest in English, is linked to the wider world. So I wrote a paper where I took this sign that you see in the middle here. This is for a language school, Achieve Goal English as a Second Language. It's a language school. It's quite a nice looking sign, but on a rather not particularly expensive back street in Cebu in the Philippines. Now, I was interested then in how this sign links to many other aspects of the world, how it's physically located next to a range of things, below a Coca-Cola sign, next to the street. It's linked then in part to the tangled wires we see up on the right there. The tangled wires often are very clearly relate to particular socioeconomic development, to access to power, to also, you often get these tangled wires because people are also taking power from there, sort of informal access to power and so on. So tangled wires give us a whole indication of development and socioeconomic conditions in particular places. When you move around clockwise, this links to the larger divisions that we see in the Philippines between rich and poor, and questions of access to English, and also what Ruani Tupas talks about, unequal Englishes, that some people get access to particular varieties of English and others to other varieties or to none at all. The socioeconomic position of the Philippines also means that a lot of people are, in a sense, exported. There are a lot of people who work abroad in various work, men typically on ships, in construction sites in the Middle East and so on. There's also been this big export of domestic workers. So quite a large part of the Philippine population works overseas, and a large part of their economy is through their remittances back to the Philippines. That's also, though, been, in a sense, like brought back in, because they also export English teachers, but it was discovered then that there was also a market for online English teaching in the Philippines, particularly paid for by Japanese and Koreans. This again became kind of gendered, like the domestic workers, gendered and sexualized industry for young graduates, women graduates, well-educated, poorly paid, but doing these online, and this was before we had the pandemic and use Zoom, this was done via Skype. They didn't make much money, and there were a range of difficult relations through these online English language teaching sites. One of the interesting things, however, about that places like Cebu is there's also quite an extensive Korean population. And part of the drive to learn English there is driven by the Koreans because the Philippines becomes a cheap place for Koreans to run businesses. Here we've got a hair salon, a lot of local Korean businesses there, including a lot of the language schools. Also because young Koreans can then go and stay in the Philippines, study English cheaply and enjoy cheap and warm living around parts of the Philippines. So it's not coincidental that this is Korea kind of marketing English through the Philippines, and two of the countries in Southeast Asia that have been particularly linked, of course, to the United States in different ways. And finally, of course, this language school is also competing with other language schools. This advert in the top left corner is from one called the English Factory. And of course, they use racialized images of native speakers who are seen as white and generally represent Americans typically. Hi, hello, I'm a native speaker and this is how you greet people. All of this comes together around, and more, but I don't have time to go into it, around this particular sign. So when we think about entanglements of English, it draws our attention to the multiple levels and ways which English is in and of this world. It's part of social and political relations, from the inequalities of North-South political economies and local material circumstances, also to the ways in which it's connected to discourses and ideologies of change, modernization, access, and desire. And recently, Lionel Wee has been writing about what he calls post-humanist world Englishes, and thinking in terms of assemblages and how this affords advantages over the view as language as an autonomous bounded system. And some of the ways we've, rather reductive ways we talked about world Englishes, English lingua franca. He sees this, the idea of language as an assemblage, providing an account of regularities, fluidities in language, which also bring into, open up the question of what actually counts as language or the linguistic. And that's an important part of this questioning. So the distributive frameworks I talked about challenge those humanist assumptions I listed earlier. So we can look at epistemology and say, well, okay, now we can think about the human mind as no longer the exclusive place of knowledge. Cognition, we can see then as human thought integrated, and not only human thought, integrated with the world around. Agency involves actants that may be objects, a range of different things, and their interrelationships, what Latour would call the networks. Identity we can see as material being in and of the world. And then language involving bodies, things, places in these assembled interactions. So the distributive frameworks and assemblages, there's an interesting, in a sense, push and pull with this. The distributive frameworks, in a sense, push language, agency, cognition, identity out into the world. So this isn't something happening in humans, in the head, it's out there in our relationship with objects, things, places, and so on. The assemblage idea or entanglements then brings that back together. It doesn't bring them back in. It says, okay, now we've got all these relationships. When do they come to matter? When do they become in things terms are happening? How do we understand these, the coming together of different things, bits of language, ideas, people, into these assemblages at particular moments? So when we go back to the question, where is language, that I started with, we can see, I think, that language plays a significant role. We're not trying to downplay, in a way, the importance of language. We know languages are very important semiotic systems that we invest a lot in, but we start to shift the grounds to the way in which we can still acknowledge their important role, but we see them as part of these assemblages that are in and of the world. So from that point of view, we can see language as a set of resources that are always part of a greater embodied, situated, distributed, and affective whole. Those are some references. I can let people have those if they'd like, and I will stop on that note. Thank you very much for listening.